Welcome to Catalyst, a podcast by DiFalco Community Center Project.
Hello, and welcome to DiFalco Community Center Project podcast Catalyst, episode 3, Black Lives Matter and Mass Incarceration. If you two would like to introduce yourselves and talk about the organizations that you are...
Just knew that was happening.
Pay no attention to the phantom that haunts this place.
Yeah.
Before I do that, let's just talk about, this is the African Roots Library, Williams-Meyers African Roots Library in Kingston, New York, on Gill Street, corner of Gill Street and East Union Street. We'll have a link to more information about that underneath the video, so you'll be able to check out events and other things that are happening here. So now I'm going to let you introduce yourselves. Do you want to introduce Althea?
Yeah. Althea is part of the movement because the children are our future. Yeah. This is our young activist, Althea. She's my daughter. And I'm Callie, Jayne, with Up Kingston. We're a grassroots community organization.
And her other daughter is at her friend's house, and her name is Lily.
Do you want to come close to the table and wave towards the camera?
Yeah. Oh, right there.
That extreme close up.
Right
that works.
Right there. All right, you can go back.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yep, and this is the movement. This is the work. Rise Up Kingston is a grassroots organization here in Kingston, led by those who are experiencing, racism and other forms of oppression. And we organize to try and win a more just community. Right now, specifically, we're working on police accountability and criminal justice, decarceration work, and also housing work, both trying to work within our current system, but also create new systems as well to ensure that everyone has everything that they need.
I'm Micah. I work with a number of different organizations doing a number of different things, but probably the one that's most connected to my being here is working with TMI Project doing facilitating Black Stories Matter, which we at first was a participant of. We then did another series a little over a year ago, Huguenot Street, New Paltz, where a number of us actually spent the evening in enslaved quarters on Huguenot Street. Then we did Black Stories Matter at the Kingston High School, working with students, and then facilitated another Black Stories event most recently, which was multi-generational, and are gearing up for the next workshop series.
Awesome, thanks so much. So I guess I'll start you off with a couple of questions. Callie, one of the things that Rise Up Kingston works on is, police accountability and also housing and housing justice. So I feel like there's probably a connection between mass incarceration and gentrification, considering that if you have a significant portion of your community missing, that's got to impact issues that affect that community.
Yeah. I think that housing and incarceration obviously are really connected. Racism is a system, it's a structure that's meant to hold people down in every level, every way, and we really did have a, mass stealing of fathers and adults from people's lives. We also, are grouping certain people, low-income people, into, certain areas through redlining and pushing people into different communities. And so it really is about the structure and the control, I think, that connects the two. Because if we have areas, like here in Kingston, we have certain areas that are more heavily policed. And basically they've used what they call a data-driven action system that they use based on the number of stops they've had in an area. They then decided that there is more crime happening there, and so therefore they need to increase the number of police that are in that area. And so they're kind of creating their own data, and it's broken windows policing. They're creating their own data. And so, that area happens to be, one of the poorest census tracts in the country, happens to be where the largest number of people of color and renters are in the community. And, it's very connected, the way that they are enforcing housing through criminalization. Even if you look at the evictions that are being held by, that are being upheld by sheriffs. It's all connected in a racist structure that's meant to hold certain groups of people down.
And to add to that, what happens when people are insecure in their housing? You have insecure housing when you don't know what it's going to be like, when your conditions are poor, to say the least, right? We're talking, heat not working, right? You don't have air, or you're living out of a microwave, right? All the things that come along with housing insecurity makes for a desperate situation for anybody to have to live in and function with. And not to mention, like, the effects of gentrification is that it's often that it's not just you that lives in those conditions, but the circle of people that you know live in those conditions, and your family also, right? That, like, so this web begins to happen. So, as we talk about this concept that we have often in our country of pulling yourself up by your bootstrap, what we know is that for a lot of people in white America, what that really means is that you have family, friends, aunts and uncles who can help you live. Either they help you a little bit financially to get started, or can give you the legal advice that you need, give you the business planning that you have, right? All of that becomes this huge network, this unseen network that allows you to rise up in a sense. And when you then look at kind of the housing insecure situation that we have, gentrification that we have, and all of that, you just have constant displacement. And we know across the globe, displacement's one of the leading reasons of war. Right, like displacement, there's a psychological toll in addition to everything else that Callie just mentioned that happens in that setting.
Yeah. Sorry, this is like really.
No.
Can we edit this out? I mean.
Nah. I mean, I know. In my mind, children are always forgiven, and this is what and as you mentioned before, this is what we're doing that for, right? I mean, that's the point. Yeah. It's too late for us, but hopefully, that we've enjoyed. I think even given all of these things. I mean, as far as just the earth providing essentially what it needs to. I mean, we've had at least reasonable, but the future going forward for the kids is like even more bleak than some of the childhoods that kids are experiencing now or when we were kids. So it's okay if they dance around the room a little. It's fine by me. I want to just piggyback off something you said about the being able to ask for help and support and everything, and it really talks about the generational wealth that has been missed in communities too. If my grandfather was not able to purchase a home because he was black, right there was no home to sell, to pass along. There was no wealth, no equity, no anything that can be held on to. And I think that a lot of people even don't think about things like the GI Bill, which initially was not something that black soldiers were allowed to use. That educated a tremendous amount of people and gave them access to a tremendous amount of things, and then certain groups of people were left out of that. And so on top of not being able to just ask for the help in the moment, there's something that's not even able to be passed down from generation to generation. Like, we just don't have it because we weren't afforded the opportunity. We started generations later in any ability to be able to accumulate wealth.
And that's and often I think in this country we talk about the income gap that exists, but we don't always talk about the wealth gap, which is even much bigger. The income gap's already big. The wealth gap is even larger, right? The average African American, when you subtract debt from whatever income they have, their net worth is $8. It's not a whole lot. You can do with $8. Right? So the idea of buying a home or starting a business becomes really difficult because you've got $8, which also again means your surrounding community. Each one of those people, they're averaging $8 too.
Yeah.
I need you to walk.
So, given the kind of increased vulnerability of communities of color due to things like mass incarceration, due to the still still dealing with the long-term effects of redlining, even though technically redlining isn't technically is no longer a legally practiced thing. As you said, the consequences that are generational. What are things that communities can do to kind of try to compensate, to try to kind of fortify their communities? I mean, I feel like the groups and the work that your groups are doing are absolutely doing that. But I feel like the everyday person living in these communities, or even things that organizations can do, I guess what I'm asking is, like, what are some potential solutions that we can and things that we can work towards to solve these problems?
That's tough. You know, Callie and I, back in the fall, with the help of Radio Kingston,
am I doing it right?
had a concert here that had reparations pricing. And I think we both knew that some people would be like, yes, it's about time. And we both knew that there are some people who would really be riled up by that and be like, why, what are you doing? And when I say some people, I mean, don't think that all black people would necessarily be like, yes, and all white people would be like, no. I mean, it was people on both sides had both feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And it was followed up by a community discussion about it.
Mommy, it's
And
broken.
I guess the reason why that's on my mind now is because a lot of the things that happened over generations, over decades, centuries, just here in our area, we both felt the need to, let's start with that. Let's just put on a paper some of these things so everyone can get a sense of like how we got here. So it was important to us, in addition to the many things that each of us do, it felt important to us that like we also just have to start the dialogue. We have to start to have the conversations about this, because in general our communities aren't. And if you don't have the conversations, if you don't, both of us I think have done a lot of work to try to uplift other people's stories and what other people have to say, so people can really hear and feel the impact. And because if you don't do that, it becomes real easy to not see it, right? It becomes really easy to just believe that it's not happening. It becomes really easy to believe that, well, we elected a black president twice. Like, what's the problem? Mm-hmm. Right? It becomes easy to be like, I see black people on TV all the time now. Mm-hmm. Like, what's the problem? Right? It becomes, it's too easy. It's too easy to that. So then it becomes easy to not have the conversation. It's never, and the other thing is, I think as a society, we want what feels good. We want actually what's easy. So to ask your community to say, this isn't going to be easy. This is actually going to be difficult. Let's have it. Let's have the conversation. Let's work through it anyway. Because change doesn't come with rainbows and sparkles and unicorns. Change comes really, change comes hard. Like it comes hard. And as a nation, we have dodged the hard discussion for a long, long time. Like we haven't done the work to repair. We haven't done that. And I don't know how anyone can expect us to honestly move forward until we do.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot in there. I'm thinking about. So the reparations concert. So I think one of the most impactful things about the reparations concert was that the reparations pricing stated that it was a suggested donation of $10.79, which is the Radio Kingston's FM frequency, which just recently started up, which is great. It's supposed to be last summer.
Last summer, we got it out now.
But 107.9, and it was suggested. And then there was a line that said people of color can get in for free. So anyone could have gotten in for free. It was the idea of somebody getting something based on the color of their skin that threw people off. Although that's what happens every day. Every day people do or don't get things. I need you to walk behind the table, my love.
No.
Sit down. This one's feral. She's the next generation. She's
You get
gonna
your
change
big
the world.
break however you can.
Yep,
she's
gonna change the world one of
You
these
seek
days.
your
So it's
opportunities.
great. But, it was the concept, and people are not willing to have the conversations about what they do or don't get. What they
Product placement advertisement for Toasty.
And we can pause at any point, and I can give her a and she'll probably sit down and be quiet. But I think she's really excited by this.
Blinking red light.
Blinking red light.
I mean, does she want to pull up a seat?
Yeah,
here?
I don't know. Don't press the button, Fee. Do you want to sit down here with us, or do you want to do something over there?
Do you want to join
And
us?
with Micah.
Mm-hmm. Well, but Micah's doing this with us.
Okay, so now we're back to entertain a child. So we can continue our discussion. So hopefully you remember what you were talking about.
Yeah, I think it's really, so we're talking about the reparations concert and the fact that so many people were just so upset about the idea of, somebody getting something for nothing. And that really shows, or somebody getting something based on the color of their skin, right? And it really shows that people don't have an understanding of how much skin color plays into not being able to get past a certain point. So we've got banks that are still being caught for not giving mortgages to, black and brown folks. We have people who are being caught not giving jobs to people of color. There was this really interesting story about a gentleman named Jose, I forget his last name. He was applying for jobs for a really long time and wasn't getting any callbacks, no callbacks. He took the S out of his name and he started calling himself Joe. Same resume, and he started getting phone calls back, right? And so people don't understand that that's going on, which is why we can't even think about reparations. Because people are like, slavery was over, slavery's done. But, Ruby Bridges is younger than my mama. I say this a lot. Ruby Bridges, one of the first black women to, black children at that point to desegregate a school is younger than my mother. It was still legal. We didn't get the right, for interracial marriage until Loving, was that 67, I think? Yeah. So all of these things, all these injustices, and were still happening in the 60s, 70s, are still happening today. The 13th Amendment, talking about slavery. I mean, there's so much control, and people don't know their history, and they don't know what's going on, which is why having the conversation about reparations is so scary and so huge, because people are still struggling, even if they're not black, and so they can't believe that, that there are people worse off than them because of their skin color. They're like, well, I've done this thing, I struggled, I did this thing, but there's a big connection to what happens when you were brought to this country as an enslaved person, and then you were not given any resources to try to actually pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and so it was an amazing moment, I think, because everywhere we went, people were talking about reparations, and it wasn't always good. It was not always good, but people were talking about reparations, and it was an amazing beach concert. Mystic Bowie's Talking Dreads were a big part of it, and Micah did a DJ set too, which was really fun, and it was an amazing way to have people talking about it. But there were some people who weren't ready for the conversation. We lost our beer vendor about a week before the event. And, in their defense, they hadn't necessarily seen initially that the whole concert was about reparations, But that also says, if we're just having a concert, because that's what we did. We had a concert, and then we gave reparations pricing. And that was, our decision to decide how much we charge our tickets for.
And again, other tickets were suggested donations.
Yes.
It's not this is a really it was a low bar.
Yeah.
And not to mention, to compare, to make an absurd comparison to show how absurd that is, nobody is, mounting a counter protest for, ladies drink free night at, a local bar.
Absolutely.
So, honestly, how is that different?
Absolutely.
We give people discounts or things free all the time.
Veterans.
Veterans, based on whatever we think is okay, right, and justified, we're willing to do it without even thinking about it. And the other point I want to make, because I think it's important, is, because you mentioned Ruby Bridges, as it being a part of recent history, you know, we also have a habit because of our educational system and our textbooks that we only talk about segregation as though it was a good thing. We only talk about it from the perspective of like, wow, look, and this happened, and then black kids were able to go to better schools. We don't talk about how it decimated, you know, whole communities, black-owned businesses, schools that were already functioning really well and at a high level for black kids. Like, we don't talk about what segregation ruined for the black community.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, we leave that out because
Yeah.
it's not convenient to the narrative of the great white hope coming in and saving the day for the country. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. Can we go a little bit more into reparations as far as like more kind of like what that would look like? Like let's say you know tomorrow somehow like Cynthia McKinney runs for president again and wins. And she's like, we're gonna have reparations. Like, what would that look? I mean, it could be anybody. I just remember I really wanting Cynthia McKinney. Like, what was that? Like 12 years ago, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, wanting her to be president. But anyway, but you know, some great president person. Yeah.
Yeah.
What would that look like?
So I want to start by saying there's this really great group out there called NACOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations. And they have, since like 1987, 89, been trying to pass a bill in Congress to study the possibility of having reparations in the United States. That bill has not even come to a vote, has not passed since I was a toddler, right? And so we're not even willing to look into what the actual financial impact is. If there's studies, like Micah said, wealth. We can talk about wealth. We can look at wealth between black families and white families. But also reparations is the fact that everywhere we look, there's mostly white people. That statues are of white people. That when we celebrate people like Sojourner Truth, the first word we use to describe her is slave. Not, you know, abolitionist, not freedom fighter. You know, so reparations, I can't tell you what reparations should look like. You know, and we haven't even talked about land and, you know, abuse and the fact that, gosh, all of these buildings were built by enslaved people. And in reality, you know, some people say reparations should be going in and being like, that's mine now. I'm going to go back and take this back. But I can't tell you what reparations look like because we haven't even spent the time looking at really what our history has actually done to our communities. And I'm just one person, so it wouldn't be fair for me to say, you know, what reparations should look like. But we've got to move forward on studying it, looking into it. And then the other just small thing I'll say is that there's acts of reparations that we can do within our communities. You know, that people who have access to wealth or access to privilege in some way, shape, or form can use as an act of reparations. You know, the way we know that people are systemically held down and have poor credit, you know, who's co-signing on loans for, you know, low income, you know, people of color who aren't able to access resources, you know, micro-lending, micro-granting, all these different things. There are ways that you can create, you know, reparations within your community, knowing that you benefited from one thing and that your neighbor has been suffering because of it. And how can you build that way?
And I'll just add to that to say, you know, before the concert, Callie and I were both on the radio. I was on your show, I think, every day for a month, and we were on different shows, and we both had lots of conversations with people in our community, and we both came from the angle just backing up what Callie said, which is because everyone's first question was how. Well, we're not at how yet. Like, we ain't even there yet. Like, we just felt like we're trying to just can we just talk about it? Can we just talk about like how we got here before we figure out even how we're going to make it happen? Like, can we all just talk about? Can we all agree that repairing needs to be done? Some kind of repairing. Like, can we get there? Or as Callie was saying, that like, can we actually pass a bill to look into it? So we have so much work to do before we even get to the like, well, what form is it going to take? How are we going to do it? And you know, and for me, you know, money, yes, everything in our society boils down to money. But in truth, underneath money is power. right? Money is just this way in which, in our society, in which it's the tangible form of power, right? But at the end of the day, you could give away money all day long, but if you have power, that money will find its way back to you over and over and over again. Unless you've given up power, nothing's really going to change.
Yeah.
Right? So, so for me, reparations, although it might take the form of money, right now I'd settle for the fact that our school systems, that it's not the kids of color who are being suspended more. I'll settle for that. Why don't we repair that system?
Yeah.
Right? Because what that leads to, and the way that it gives the kids in the classroom, the way that we see white kids having more power, the way that we see that they're more likely to get into honors classes, while black kids are more likely to be suspended, like, that's a problem of our system. And that sets up an unequal balance of power, which sets up unequal opportunities for wealth, and everything else that we have in our society.
I mean, and just thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement, or the phrase Black Lives Matter, right? We have all types of, events, campaigns that can push forward ideas that will educate people about certain issues, right? This is what, here's dementia, let's do an overnight walk for, suicide prevention, different breast cancer actions, this, that, and we have addressed that there is a concern here where, specifically the Black Lives Matter movement was, founded out of a love letter to black people during this time of, I mean, it's still happening, but during this time of, a lot of, murders and of extrajudicious executions of black folks on the street, right? And people are angry about the phrase Black Lives Matter. And we can't have the conversation with people yet that something has happened and is happening to black people that white people are not experiencing. And so when people say to me, all lives matter, right, as a response to Black Lives Matter, I start to ask them, can you give me an example of a time when that was true, right? And they're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, a time when that was true, when all lives, including black lives, mattered. Right? I didn't coin that one. I don't know. I heard it somewhere. I don't know. That's not, TM Callie. But it just makes people think. And some people still don't want to have a conversation. It's fine. It's not like this magic, bullet thing that's going to change everything. But it gets people thinking about how do we move forward. And that's the point where we're at, is like having the conversation of, wait a minute, there is injustice. Wait a minute, I didn't know that this would happen. Wait a minute, maybe there is something that we need to do because it's still, this is still happening. I think that's really important.
Yeah. So I want to go back briefly. This is all so related, but going back to the all the things. Because when we were talking about children are the future, and I was like, we're right. The future for children now is even more bleak looking, and I need to qualify that because I mean for us here in America or the developed Western world, because right now Mozambique is underwater, and other places and other communities in this world that don't have the wealth, don't have the capital, don't have anything that Western powers would be interested in, so they're not necessarily occupied, are feeling the effects that we're all afraid of. They're feeling them now, and we forget about that. We don't talk about that, and it's mostly in countries with people of color. And again, because it's not part of kind of our Western network, it's not where we're sourcing our oil, it's not where we're sourcing any of the other things that we want. So there are children right now who are actually suffering these things that we are afraid of, us in our kind of more cozy situation. But we're the ones who caused what the effects that they're suffering. We did that, like the Western nations and the U.S., China, and all the other big industrial nations caused what people in the other parts of the world are feeling. So anyway, I just wanted to because I realized I was like that that wasn't a true statement.
Well, but that's that power, and you know what Micah was talking about with money and power. You know, I've been reading bell hooks lately with feminist theory, and I'm not one of those like reader folks often, but this book kind of like blew my mind and feels like even though it was written in '84, it could be, you know, written today and is very true in many scenarios today. But you know what she really talked about is domination, right? You know, this idea that somebody else can dominate someone else, and the way that she's talking about it specifically is within feminism, that, you know, the feminist movement has always been like based around this idea of, you know, women just being the victims, men being the enemy. But within that, women being the victims concept, they haven't ever looked at how they can also be oppressive and dominating on other groups. And so that can be white women over, you know, black women, white women over, you know, family, you know, women over families. You know, there was this interesting layer about, you know, how we are teaching our kids as they grow up, because I said so, because I'm the parent, because this, because that, and we're dominating our children and expecting them to just, you know, be, and then go out into the world, and we wonder why they're being dominated by, you know, capitalism, by systems, by, you know, this desire for greed, by all of this, because we have taught them that way, not actually giving them, you know, choice and autonomy over their bodies, right? And so if we don't like step out of this idea of we need to dominate somebody else to make money off of somebody else, you know, that's what's happening in all these, you know, countries all over, then we're not actually going to be able to push things forward and change, because people aren't realizing, they're looking at these symptoms versus a mindset. Like a mindset of controlling others and dominating others is what's getting us to all these things where we have no housing, because people have housing portfolios and they would rather make money than ensure that people have homes. You know, domination, you know, the same thing with mass incarceration. There's stuff that needs to be done, and we can require people who are in, you know, enslaved essentially in the jails, to do those things, and in the prisons to do those things. And so the deep system is, do we believe it's okay for one person to have control over another person, to be dominating somebody else? And if we can break out of that, then we can try and break down some of these other levels of, you know, all the isms.
And just going off of that, there's how long are we going to continue to believe, although we live in an incredibly abundant planet, how long are we going to continue to believe that there somehow isn't enough?
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's this belief that there is scarcity, and in order for me to secure mine, I've got to be able to take from you. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, it's, you know, back to the housing thing for a second. Like what about this? What about nobody gets 2 homes until everybody's got 1?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Who needs 2?
Yep.
It's a luxury. No one needs 2 until everybody's got 1. That would make everybody who currently has 2 or is working towards 2, that would make all of them work really hard to make sure everybody's got 1.
Yeah.
Because they still want their 2.
Yeah.
So just make them work hard so that way we can all have 1.
Because there's enough.
Because there's enough. There's enough here.
I was crashing.
We live in an abundant planet. Sorry.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was crashing at my friend was temporarily renting, almost like a long-term Airbnb, this house in Kingston, and she was like, oh, well, I do cleaning for, like, you know, the other house, and that's how I, like, learned that this was going to be empty temporarily, and this is a woman with a young child, but then I was like, oh, so they live there. She's like, well, no. She's like, they live, and I forget where she said they live. I'm like, wait a minute. So they have a second and third home. Mm-hmm. They're right next to each other. Mm-hmm. And she's like, yeah. And I'm like,
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the portfolio piece. You know, that people are buying up homes because they have access to wealth, and they are then making a profit off of people living in those homes. Mm-hmm. And there is more than enough in terms of money, in terms of finances. I mean, if we think about, you know, what's happening with the Kingstonian right now, we are putting a tremendous amount of public money into this luxury, you know, hotel / apartment building with a swanky pool that's going to bring the hip, cool folks to Kingston that can shop. A pool. Which when they presented this whole thing, they're sitting there like, and that's on the sunniest side of the building, because who needs a pool when there's no sun? And we're just like, you are so out of touch. It's mind-blowing to me. But we're looking at this, and public dollars are going into that. And I'm like, $6 million of, DRI funds, plus we're going to look at, payment in lieu of taxes, which is going to benefit the school district. And the school district is broke, and the school board members have the opportunity to vote against this pilot if it goes past the planning board stage, and the Kingstonians approved, but sorry, I'm kind of like going on a tangent here, but like this is the example of it, that they're coming in and they are saying to the business owners who are suffering too, the small business owners are suffering, and they believe that if they bring in wealthier people, those wealthier people can then shop at their businesses and will make their businesses thrive. But what they don't understand is all the money that we're giving to the Kingstonian, we could figure out. Budgets are about priorities, right? We could make sure that the small business owners' taxes aren't going up tremendously. We think of these organizations and people are frustrated about, the signs of gentrification. But how do we make our communities better? I think I'm quoting you on this one, for the people who live here, right? Because what happens is you do something that makes your community better, and then your property taxes go up. And then you can't live there anymore. You can't, be a part of it anymore. And we can't allow our public community dollars to pad the pockets of people who are already tremendously wealthy, who have properties, who have portfolios, who are making money. Their money is making money. That's the part that they're at. And we have people, over 400 families in Ulster County are placed in motels that have, broken doors, that don't have proper heat, that only have a microwave for them to cook in for months at a time, that have bed bugs, which the state considers a nuisance, not a health concern. Roaches, also not really a concern. We look at all these different levels. We have boarding homes that people know are withholding food from folks. We have all these situations going on and on and on, yet we have money to put up this luxury building here in Kingston.
For people who aren't here.
For people who aren't here yet. Mm-hmm. For people who aren't here yet. Yeah.
So we're going to take a quick break so we can digest that information.
Perfect.
Because it's also too, like, the developers who own those buildings, like, they're not going to be spending their money here, even if the people that rent those apartments are.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that's that's going to get us into a whole other conversation. So we're going to take a brief break. We can have some snacks. And also, in between these segments, we're gonna Odell, who is not exactly here right now because we pre-filmed those segments, is gonna give a virtual tour of the library and the different sections of the library and talk a little bit more about this place. So enjoy that in between segments.
My name is Odell Winfield, and I am one of the co-founders of the A.J. Williams-Meyers African Roots Library here in Poughkeepsie, Kingston. First, let me give you some background about the library's mission statement, and then I will take you on a tour of the books and other artifacts that was donated to the library. The mission statement is to establish an African Roots Library in the Kingston Roundout area that will promote literacy through the teachings and learnings about African roots experience, including history and culture through a dynamic exchange of information, ideas, and creativity. We have we put together this mission statement because it's very important that we have people that walk through the doors to see material and resources that look like them. That's what this is for. Our vision is to honor and encourage the transition of history through written and oral history, spoken word, paintings, cultural artifacts, and other forms of artistic expression. We celebrate the multifaceted ways to acquire knowledge. We believe that knowledge of the diverse cultural roots of people in our community needs to be understood and spread through sharing and learning about one another. Very important, because like I said, the collection here is basically, the foundation is African roots. However, we have people of the earth, we have Native American, and we have Spanish writers, poets, literary writers, novels, and our children's collection have a number of different writers who express stories from the streets. Let me put it that way. Stories from the streets is very connected to the young folks that come into the library. What we do with adults, we have different sections where we try and express to the community things that's taken place in the history of America that includes people of color, American citizens, African American citizens, Native American citizens, Spanish citizens, and other cultures. We want everybody to be able to walk through them doors and hear something about their culture in this space. So that's what we do. How we do it? We have what we call the Real History Series. The Real History Series is a program where we use our elders, including the retired professor whose name the library is named after, Dr. A.J. Williams-Meyers. We have Dr. Ari Dixon. We have Paul Bermanzon. We have Sally Bermanzon. We have Pierre Leroy, a Haitian retired teacher. And we try and explain to the community, when we use our elders to validate whatever subject matter we're talking about, we try and make sure that the community is included in the conversation. And the way we do that is have a speaker talk about an issue and then open it up to the community to be a part of the discussion. Now, this collection on this side starts with people from Africa. We have novels, resource books, and in this section here, Native Americans. We have Native Americans, and from here, from the second shelf down, we start a Spanish collection from all the South American countries and the Spanish population of America. Okay. This section is basically my resources, where I am now putting together our collection. One thing, we only been open a year, so we're still going through the development stages of our collection, particularly the adult collection. Right. I will show you, and I promise I will, the children's collection a little later.
Okay, so we're back. You had mentioned earlier about students in schools, especially now that there's cops in schools, that children of color are disciplined at different rates than white kids, and that of course goes to the school to prison pipeline. So if either of you would be interested in talking about that.
Yeah, I think part of what all this, maybe the most important piece to think about with all of this, and Callie, you talked about it before, is it's the systems that we have in place and the systems that we inherently uphold, often even when we don't want to, we uphold them. And it's, in this, the reality is that the going back to slavery, right just before the Civil War, when both the North and South started measuring their output, right? The North felt like they had a pretty solid argument, right? They were like, we have various means of production. That's why our yield is more. And the South was strongly rooted in, we have free labor. That's why we have the best, the largest yield. Civil War happens, but, no one was about to give up, like, just like that, and be like, oh, well, yeah, we messed up. Let's make sure everybody gets that 40 acres and a mule, and we'll set it right. And so, instead, what you had was the systems that allowed this feeling of scarcity to stay intact, that allowed, and I'm not even going to say white America, that the system that allowed wealthy white Americans, a small group, to remain in power, keep that structure in place, meant that the divide, the unrest that happened between poor white America and poor people of color, African Americans, like, all those systems needed to stay in place to support the power structure that was already established, because those with power weren't about to give it up. And so, yes, slavery ended, but we've just seen that be replaced by a penal system. And, and how do you get people in prison? How do you keep those systems in place? It goes back to how we raise our young people. It goes back to how we treat them in schools. It goes back to even the sense of possibility that we instill in them, right? I've been talking a lot for myself, and it's different than the school to prison pipeline, but it's a part of that system. I grew up in Mount Vernon, New York, right? So just above the Bronx. I even went to college in SUNY Purchase, which is in Westchester, and it only hit me a few months ago that I went all those years of schooling, kindergarten through college, without one teacher of color. That's bananas, right? But again, if you try to see it as non-systemic, then it looks unfortunate. Like, wow, how did that happen? If you see it as non-systemic, then it looks like, wow, we really need more teachers of color. What can we do to get more teachers of color? But if you see it as systemic, then you realize it's not like this by accident. Mm-hmm. It's not like this just because, there weren't enough teachers of color in that area, right? Like, it's bigger, it's deeper, it's entrenched, more entrenched than that, and it's been entrenched ever since Europeans first set foot here and started decimating the people that lived here. It's been entrenched ever since they first decided, we're going to bring over slave labor. Mm-hmm. And made the decision to enslave people, because all of these things set up systems of power. And from what I can tell in human history, looking across the globe, I haven't seen any examples of humans that have willingly given up power. So instead, you create systems that keep you in power. You create systems that keep the money flowing to you. Mm-hmm. And what's important, if the money's going to flow to you, it's important that all the poor white people, because you don't really like them either. You don't have love for them either. Donald Trump would rather hang out with a wealthy black man than a poor white person any day of the week. Mm-hmm. So what's important in your system is that all of them, they're fighting over scraps. All of them will never stop and look long enough at the systems that are keeping them oppressed to say, oh, wait, can't we just, aren't there more of us than them? Mm-hmm. Can we change this?
There's been these brief moments where, like the labor movement, which we're actually reading about in this book for the book club, this library book club, and it addresses that very directly. But I mean, there were labor organizers running around, and like they're very honest about it. It's not like these people were trying to bring in the farmers and the black people, the farmer slaves, out of the goodness of their heart because they cared about them, but they understood that these people were, even after slavery, were still being paid far, far less, and that while they had that competition, that their labor movement wasn't going to be so strong unless they pulled in the people of color. So even then, they were not doing it for the right reasons. Mm-hmm. But even though they were doing it for selfish reasons, they still fucked it up. They still effed it up. We've sworn these before. Nobody's ever We were on the last one, like we were doing like male privilege and feminism, and we were just like 7 women in a room, just like. But anyway, so so even then, like that was a great opportunity to like unite all of these people or make everybody realize that we all have the same enemy, but still didn't work. Still didn't do it, and everybody forgot.
Yeah, and so the best way to keep the system in place is fight hard against the people that are trying to unify, and get those young people right in the system and on the way to prison.
Yeah.
Get them there early.
There was this time when it became illegal to bring Africans over to the United States, but a person that was born by an enslaved person, was also then an enslaved person. And so women, black women at a certain time towards the end of legal slavery were just being impregnated again and again and again, and then the baby was then, it's like raised as this, now you can be a slave, right? And Angela Davis talks about how DSS kind of operates in that same way, going into the houses of families who don't have access to, food, wealth, roof overhead, all those things, saying that, and maybe the fathers have been taken out because of, drug-related crime, and then saying that the child needs to go into programs. We see children as young as 8 being sent into, children's homes, which teach them to learn to survive, instead of how to thrive, and they don't educate them. And we see children of color as young as, 3 or 4 being suspended for doing things that 3 and 4-year-olds do, and typically it's happening to black children and not to white children. There's systems, yes, but those systems I think are also based on the people in those systems. And so we've got people who view black skin as the danger. That's the weapon in and of itself. That's the thing that is eliciting fear in people. And so we've got teachers who aren't aware of their biases, and they are traumatizing young children in schools. They are suspending them. They are, treating them differently. And so I guess I am really good at facts, because like in Kingston, 6 times more black kids are being suspended than their white peers. And if we look at the graduation rates, same things. We are seeing black kids and Latinx kids and special needs kids, to be honest, not graduating as high, And so we're just seeing this white supremacy, not KKK, not white supremacists, not, but this supremacy of whiteness in all of our systems. And so when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, if an 8-year-old child, for example, throws a snowball, and that snowball has ice in it, and that ice hurts the face of a white child, now the black child has assaulted someone. The black child is then sent to, a program where, kids who are struggling, who are dealing with trauma, are all thrown into something where they're getting no resources. We see this right down the street, right here at this boys' home. We then see those kids get introduced, sometimes sent back to school and not given any resources. Sometimes they don't return to school, and then they are introduced to, the law by being stopped by the police, by, all of that happens. And it's a system where they are feeding into the prison industrial complex. And even here, there's a narrative shift that needs to happen, because people look at opening jails as a good thing because it creates jobs. People get scared when jails are closing because, like, what about the jobs? But if your job relies on locking up humans in order to make money, that's not okay. And we have to figure out other ways to do things. And why are we investing money in creating jails instead of investing money to keep kids out of jails? So these are the types of things that we have to really look into when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, and a lot of it is dark skin, right? There's a lot of it that's dark skin, and I'm grateful and feel horrified sometimes that I'm grateful that my children are light skinned, because they pass. and they're not likely, maybe, to go through as much racism that I've gone through. And I grew up in a primarily white, very wealthy area in Fairfield County, Connecticut. And it wasn't until I got older that I was like, whoa, wait a minute, that's why when we all dressed up as like the Fred Durst Nookie girls, why only I got suspended and no one else did. You know, why I sat in school suspensions all the time for speaking out. When we protested, you know, dress codes, why I was the only one that got suspended, because like I was the black one. And it took me forever to realize this, like looking back and being like, man, I used to sit in that in-school suspension room like at least 5 days a month, you know, just staring out at the window. Meanwhile, I'm taken out of class. I'm not a part of this. You know, graduated with a 2.76 GPA. They were like, just go, you know. And it was this system that like I didn't even realize that I was a part of. And when you are a black child in a primarily white school, you don't know it's a system, you think it's you. And even our schools here, which are a little more diverse, there's a class aspect of it. You know, in one school, children can have completely different experiences based on what they look like. You know, if you're light-skinned, if you're dark-skinned, if you're big, you know, there's this big black boy syndrome where, you know, and even with black women too, where standing up for something puts you out as angry or scary, or don't raise your voice, or you were talking back, or things that when white children do, it's not treated the same. And so it's systems, it's structures, it's testing that has set up, you know, kids that are not white to not do as well. It's also people who hold the power to uphold these systems. And if we have a rule that says we can suspend someone based on, you know, their scary behavior, then who gets to decide what's scary, you know? But that's how the school to prison pipeline has been working in this way, and that's how they will continue to be able to fill their jails and prisons with black children who were children at one time and were just fed into this pipe because they needed people there. You know, one more thing I just want to say about this. We recently had a quasi-victory in New York State. We didn't get exactly what we wanted, but we were trying to eliminate cash bail. And we got to a point where probably 90% of the people who, you know, were being held unfairly because of their inability to pay bail are not going to go through that anymore. But there are still some challenges in it. So, you know, basically it's misdemeanors, nonviolent misdemeanors, and then certain, you know, felonies that now are not eligible for cash bail. So there's, you know, other release things that are not connected to money bail. But there's still a problem there, because when someone is accused of one of these other violent crimes, they're still being locked up just because of their inability to pay. And so one of the things that we've been talking about as, you know, how do we move forward, because we had both a governor and, you know, we had all of our leadership at the state level promising to eliminate cash bail, and it has not happened. But we're also thinking about the fact that it doesn't officially start until next year. And so between now and then, you know, there's going to be all of these people who are still going to be reprimanded based on this system. And so we're going to have to be pushing and saying, like, well, wait a minute. We know that come January, you know, now you're not supposed to apply bail. We should stop this now because we've discovered it's unjust. We know it's unjust. You know, you think of Callie Browder, who, you know, was in solitary confinement for years over, quote unquote, stealing a backpack, you know. And so we have to, yeah, we'll find Band-Aids in a second. And so, you know, we have to think about things like that he was not ever charged with a crime. I mean, he was charged with a crime. He was never found guilty of a crime. Eventually, they dropped the charges after forcing him to take plea deal after plea.
So I plugged the camera in but forgot to make sure the power strip was on. So I was halfway there. But anyway, so if you want to continue.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so we're just talking about the school to prison pipeline and just thinking about how these systems, you know, turn young children into criminals. You know, in the case of Callie Browder, for him to be a young boy accused of stealing a backpack and then spend years in jail at Rikers in solitary confinement, and he came out and, you know, he committed suicide because of the trauma that he experienced, and he was just a boy. He was a little boy, you know. So these systems are set up to keep us trapped in here, and he was in there because he couldn't pay his bail. So we're doing a lot locally to, figure out what the county's plan is, specifically here in Ulster County, but it's happening across the state, to what the county's plan is to handle all of the people who are being held right now because of bail, and how they're going to change that, knowing that this is, something, a law that has been changed recently. And, moving forward, are they going to continue to give people bail and hold them just because of their inability to pay it, or are they going to move forward trying to ensure people's pretrial liberty? And so that's kind of where we're at right now around that issue. And quickly, before I have to leave, I think, we're also working and moving forward on legislation to change our police commission here in the city of Kingston, because we have identified that our police commission, which is appointed by solely the mayor, consists of 3 community members, the police chief and the mayor, and the corporation counsel for the city of Kingston. The lawyer is always in the room during the interrogation. We've identified the police commission, the way it's set up now, is not working. So we're following along with other models in other areas that have actually tried to have real civilian oversight boards, and we're moving that forward so that when we do have police officers that are abusing their power, that community members can feel safe knowing that if they make a complaint, something will happen. And so if you're interested and involved, in getting involved with that, riseupkingston.org, Rise Up Kingston on Facebook. On April 27th, we are also having a criminal justice action night over at the United Methodist Church at 122 Clinton Avenue. We'll be taking different actions to move forward some of these campaigns around bail and police accountability. Also, we'll be trying to do some trainings on alternatives to calling the police. Unfortunately, we live in a space right now where everyone calls the cops on everything for everything. We were recently part of a meeting where people were very proudly saying they were calling the cops on, black kids playing basketball in the corner, trying to get the cops to move them out. And so, we're going to try and do that and encourage people to, really spread the word of, let's not bring military violence into our communities when it's not necessary. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for being here and for all the work that you do. That stuff's all very, very important. A friend of mine, just to add on to that, a friend of mine nannies for a young black child. He's 9 years old. He is tall, big for his age. He's one of the most gentlest, sweetest. He's like a Pied Piper. People just like gather around him and like collect around him. He just has this like very galvanizing, like demeanor. So he's playing with all these kids and they're like playing tag, and this woman comes at him and she's like, I saw you push my son. You pushed my son down. If you don't stop, I'm going to call the police on you. And he's like, well, and his first thought wasn't even like, oh my God, she's calling the police. He was like, oh my God, did I hurt somebody?
Yeah. Like
that was his, so he went kind of sat, and he was all kind of, and so my friend came over. She's like, what's the matter? And he was like, well, this, she said, he's like, but I don't think I like did anything, but she says that I hurt this kid, and I feel really bad, like really just taking it to heart, like assuming that she was a rational thinking human adult. And my friend was just like, oh no. She's like, this isn't how adults behave.
Yeah.
Like adults don't call the police on children. Like that's not how this is not how this works. And she like laid it out for him, and she said, she even took her a while. She's like, oh, is it just because he's like a big kid? And then she went over to talk to the woman, and the woman just kind of like saw that she was the adult with this child, turned tail and ran. And that was the moment she's like, oh, it's because he's the black child. That's why this is happening. And it took her a minute, but eventually but this is a New Paltz. It's happy, tolerant, wonderful New Paltz.
Yeah.
This kind of stuff is going on. And like, what if he was there? What if he was just a neighborhood kid, lived across the street, and he didn't have a adult there to come to his defense? Or explain to him that he didn't do anything wrong, because he would have walked away feeling like really had hurt feelings, thinking he'd done something wrong.
Types of trauma.
Yeah. But anyway, sorry, I know you have to go.
Yeah, no, thank you.
But yeah, thanks
right.
so much
Cool.
for coming here, and I'm also going to make sure to put the links for the website like underneath the video too. So if you want to click on the Rise Up Kingston website and check that stuff out.
Cool.
All right, have a good day. Good luck at the fundraiser
Thanks.
today.
Do you want to stop it just for 1 sec? So
Oh, sure. Okay. So we lost Callie, but we still have Micah. So while we still have you, can we talk a little bit more about Black Stories Matter and that whole?
Yeah. So Black Stories Matter is a part of TMI Project, and for those that don't know, TMI stands for Too Much Information, and it's writing kind of workshop that helps people to tell the part of their stories that that we often feel are too embarrassing or we're ashamed of, and so in the process of telling our stories and getting it out, the work is then through the facilitators, it's edited to be kind of a TMI monologue, which is often the workshop often culminates in a performance, so people are able to read their writing in front of others, which is an incredibly powerful experience. To be able to take the part of your stories that we often keep hidden, but are usually extremely human, right? Like they're the parts of our stories that actually everyone can kind of connect with. And the power to be able to take it and share it usually even changes our own feelings about it, right? There's a power that we're able to take when we're able to do that with our stories. And Black Stories Matter is an initiative of that project. So as I said, I was first in it as a participant. It's probably about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago. And that was the first time Black Stories Matter had been done. So there were maybe 9 of us in that final performance who shared our stories, our personal stories. And since then, it's, like I said earlier, it's gone on now in a few other iterations. But one of the things that I think is really important, because it came up when I was a participant, there was one person who was in it who, in their free writing, wrote something along the lines of, is this going to be the one time I get to tell my story? And if so, what story do I tell? And it resonated for all of us, because I think we were all like, wait, like, am I trying to tell my Black story, right? The time when I was so impacted by race, so impacted by the color of my skin. And what became clear over time is that that's not the case. What became clear actually is that what's most powerful is that we all have stories. In this case, the participants were all Black, but because we're Black, whatever story we have to tell is a Black story that matters. It doesn't really matter if it's about, those pinnacle times when like our race was, a part of our struggle, like, is just as important, I think, for just the writer to be able to tell whatever story it is that they feel they need to tell. Partly because as a community we've been, there's this, the aspect that there's like one, that we're a monolith, right? That there's like one Black perspective, that one way of thinking, which is already very non-human, right? Like it's a way of actually treating the Black experience in this way that's not human. The reality is that there are as many different Black experiences as there are Black people, right? That we all have, and we all have different viewpoints and different beliefs. As I was saying earlier, even with reparations concert, I think there were some people who had the thought that like, oh, so the people who were against it were white and the people who were for it were Black, which wasn't the case, right? There were people who felt both ways on both sides of that. And so back to Black Stories Matter, this opportunity to be able to get up on stage as a Black person myself and share my story, even that first time, it was amazing because it was a sold out crowd, right? So there were like over 500 people there, and I was so struck by, like, I was like, that many people in our community want to come out and hear Black stories? And first the answer to that question was yes. And then seeing and being able to speak to people who were there and seeing how moved people were. My story in particular touched on what it was like to grow up watching TV and movies knowing that the one character that looked like you was always going to die first. And like the impact of that, right? There's a psychological toll that I think that takes. And how many white people in the audience then came to me and were like, I never realized, I never saw that, I didn't know. And that felt really meaningful for people to be able to like take a different view of that. Because even if they weren't black, I think everyone could relate in some way to like, oh wait, really? Like, I can't, like, that's the world that you grew up in. Like, and everyone could relate to like, just at least conceptually, like, what it means to grow up in a world where like the character that looks like you is always dying.
If there's a character that looks like you at all.
If there's a character that looks like you at all, right. So, and all of the collective stories, the reason why, in addition to this fear of scarcity that keeps us kind of locked in, I think the other part to all of these systems that we have in place and this fear that we all have is that in order for me to deal with my fear of scarcity, as I said earlier, I might have to justify taking from you. But if I see you as the same as me, then I can't really take from you. So I have to see you as different than me. I have to other you, right? And I can other you based on gender or sexual preference or religion or fictitious borders that we've created, skin color, right? Like the list goes on and on and on in the ways in which I can other you. And if I've sufficiently done that, then I can justify for myself why it's okay for me to take them. So the power of being able to get up and hear people's stories, which are deeply human, to me is incredibly important, because when you really connect, when you hear somebody else's story, it gets really hard to other them. You start seeing before you a human, and the more you see them as human, the more you're going to see the similarities between you and them. The more the more you see that, the harder it becomes to do them harm. The harder it becomes to justify, whatever actions you might have been okay doing before. And the reality is that although we are all individuals, this othering process happens on a deeply social level. So even though each black person is different, each Catholic person is different, right? Even though each group of these people are different, because we do this in our society, nonetheless, the benefit to that, if there is one, is that when I begin to connect and see this black person in my community as being more human, it opens up the doorway for me to also now being able to see all of them as being more human. That being said, we also have this great capacity in our own cognitive dissonance to get around that, right? Like we can also say, we've been doing this. America's been doing this for decades, right? That like there are people who are deeply racist, but whose favorite athlete is black. People can be deeply racist and their favorite musician is black, right? So don't get me wrong. It's not that like we don't have the ability to to dodge that, but in general, when we connect with someone that's human, and especially when that human might be an other, it begins to dismantle the othering process. So for me, that's really important, because I don't put a lot of faith in policy. Policies change. The progress of our politics is precarious at best. So for me, what's most important, what has felt most alive for me is the deeply connecting with other people. It's the being able to see each other as humans, and the most powerful tool that I've ever seen for that is storytelling. when people tell their personal stories, especially because we live in a world where statistics can always be bent to whoever wants to get whatever they want out of it. Facts, we know we live in a world of facts and alternative facts. It's easy to, because of social media, it's easy to be surrounded by people that just think like you, and because they think like you, then there'll be all the supporting documentation that you could possibly need to support people thinking like you. So the only thing that kind of cuts through all of that, whether it's what you believe in or don't believe in, whether it's what you're fighting for or fighting against, the thing that seems to kind of cut through all of that in a world where it's hard to tell what true is that I can believe your story. And you've gotten up on the stage to tell me your story, to tell me your truth. I can believe that. And that seems to be, from my experience, it's deeply transformative work, not only for the storyteller, but for the audience as well.
So I didn't get to see the first round of Black Stories Matter, but I was at the one during this recent Black History Month. And as soon as I got home, both me and my friends that I had gone with were just like trying to post, because there's the what was it, Radio Kingston recorded
Radio
it,
Kingston,
and we were just like
live.
sharing it everywhere. It's like, if you weren't here, like, find time to watch this, because again, it's that. As I think the camera was off when I was talking before, but we have this tendency to lump together the Black experience, like every single Black person has the exact same experience, or the Indigenous experience, like all the Indigenous nations of this world went through the exact same thing, even though they were in like vastly different parts of the country and like 500 different nations and different cultures and languages, but they all went, and even now, the struggles of each different nation is still different. This one is, they're dealing with border crossing rights with Canada. These ones are dealing with developers or uranium mines. So like, for me, the powerful thing was just the fact, kind of like you said, it wasn't, their stories weren't even necessarily about them being Black, although obviously that's apparent, and it was definitely a part of their story, but that's not what their stories are about. You know what I mean? They're very, and that, and it was like, I don't even know how you selected the people. That one was generational, you said?
That one, we specifically wanted this multi-generational cast. So there were a couple of people who had been in, most of whom had been in Black Stories Matter before. A couple of students from when we did at the high school, a couple of other people from other workshops, a couple from the original cast, and then we were able to work with Odell to help him tell his story. Because we just realized that we had done the high school, but we were interested in, well, what if we have all these different generations together in one story? Because part of the other thing that struck Dara, who's the person who it's her and I who facilitated them. One thing that struck us was, especially working with high school students, there was something beautiful and painful about listening to their stories and being like, you're still going through the same thing, and so there's it feels like there's having the different generations, there's a thread there which feels important. Again, just going back to what we were saying earlier, I think we live at a time where the struggles of being African American in this country, I think, can be easy to dismiss. It can be easy to be like, well, it's better now, isn't it? So to be able to hear the struggles of these young people and see how they're the same and also different from older people, and at the same time, like you said, also just hear the stories that aren't about necessarily their skin color at all. Mm-hmm. All of that just felt important to us, and to cast it in that light. And then the following day, we had just like an open house kind of workshop here, actually. And it was amazing because we just happened to have about half the room. They just happened to sit at that end. We're all fairly young, under 20, most probably under 16, and over at this end we're older. And but again, hearing the experiences of what people wrote and how everyone was feeling about it was really beautiful. It's beautiful. One thing that everybody noticed was, especially here in this area, there aren't a lot of spaces that we really have as African Americans, especially outside of the church, to really feel like here's sacred space. So that's one thing that was beautiful. But then the other thing that was really beautiful was to be able to hear, just the differences in ages and experiences. To be able to reflect on that. There were some of us who were older who, I think were able to remember a little bit the experiences of being young, and there's just a lot of wisdom shared and a lot of experience shared, which is beautiful, and it was nice to be able to put that together into terms of an evening for people to be able to see.
Yeah, and I remember the discussion after, not the thing here, but the performance, all the comments that people had, and with connecting with the there was the man who I think was Freedom Walker, right, talking about the gentrification,
yeah.
And then there was the man in the audience who was like, this is what I'm combating now, and just seeing those connections was really important. I think the other thing that's so great about it is we're used to hearing about Harriet Tubman's story and Frederick Douglass's story and all of these prominent people, and not all that's very important, and obviously the impacts on history is super, super important, but also just the regular everyday people living every day, everywhere, dealing with these things, whether it's, they're dealing with it from, and just as a human, or if they're dealing with it as an organizer, whatever. It's so awesome to hear the stories of just regular people that aren't these dead, famous, historical, characters. I'm all about AOC, but I would like to also, hear about people who are not famous Congress people. You know what I mean? I want to hear about regular people and what they're doing every day and how they're interacting in their communities, and that was also, I think, that's.
Yeah, I think what's so important about that, going back to what I was saying before, how I think in this country one can be racist and yet their favorite athlete is black, but the reason why that exists is because one can have very different feelings and beliefs around the outlier, right? So you can see them as exceptional, which then allows you to keep all of your other feelings intact for the people that you pass every day. And so I think that speaks to what you're saying, that part of what's also why it's so important that these are just the people in your community is because they're not outliers, right? They're not somebody who you can in our own minds justify as being exceptional. But look at their exceptional skill or their exceptional brain,
they're one of the good
their
ones.
exceptional ability, or one of the good ones. Instead, you get away from this kind of outlier syndrome, which is not always so helpful. Mm-hmm. And instead, so even more so, it speaks to that, I can just connect with you and hear your story as a human. So I think it's powerful work.
Yeah, well, I would wholeheartedly agree. Is there anything else that you want to, about any of the other things that you're involved in, or anything else that you didn't get a chance to say based on anything else that we were talking about? You just want to get the hell out of here.
I do have to run.
Yeah.
But no, I'm super appreciative of doing this. It's Callie and I get to speak often enough, but it's still nice to do. There's so many. It's important. It's important topics, important discussions that, as I said earlier, that I just think it's about time we start having.
Yeah, I was hoping that we'd have our New Paltz folks and the Kingston folks all at the same table. Looks like we're gonna have to film that separately.
Next time.
I still need Anthony to be in a room with Callie because he has done he's an attorney who has worked for not anti-gentrification community development organization in the South Bronx that's existed for like 40 years. And I'm like, they should get in a room together and talk about it. But you know, if it's not this, I'll get them together at one point or another. But you know, part of our organization is, you know, we don't want to necessarily always be the speakers, but we want to be the megaphone, you know, or we want to be the venue, we want to be the podium, you know, whatever, for anybody and everybody to use. Anyway, thank you again so much, and I will see you at some point soon. Probably
For sure.
at Kingston.
For sure.
It's kind of a secret. Well, I guess not anymore.
Not anymore.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm back. And like I said, I was going to take you on a tour of some of our young folks' literature. Here we have our fiction. These are young story books where either the young person ages 6, 7, 8 can either read or have it or be a part of a read aloud. And we have volunteers that read with the young kids. Down here, basically, it's some novels, and for young, really middle school kids and late elementary schools. The same thing is with this. These are board books, big board books. As you can see, they're called picture books. These here are People of the Earth. We have a general collection. We have an African American collection and a Native American collection. So these are the books, and those are the colors for each one that will say which book is which. Some of these houses, these are the story houses that was created by the young folks. That's what they do. Up top, we try and highlight some materials that we are reading with young kids right now. As you can see, there was Barack Obama. There's She Persisted, Black Panthers. These are articles that, books that young kids have said they would like to read or read with one of the volunteers. So that's our collection for young folks. And I can take you later back to the adult section and show you some of the other things that we have done.
So hello, welcome to part 2 of Catalyst Podcast, part two of, anyways, part 2. Because we couldn't get all these people in the room together, so we had to do separate discussions. So I'm gonna let you introduce yourselves and kind of talk, whatever you want to talk about, organizations that you've worked with or things that you've done that relate to the topics of Black Lives Matter, mass incarceration. Of course, gentrification falls under that and all the other subtopics.
So hi, I'm Anthony Winn. I am a 25-year professional in nonprofits and activism, working in education, housing development, environmental justice, education reform, housing reform, you name it. Over that time, I've gotten my hands into quite a few pieces of work involving communities. I most recently accepted the position of executive director of the Baltimore Community Mediation Center.
You put it to camera to break this to me?
Yes, I didn't think about it. I didn't think about it. I didn't think about it until just now, but I had to tell you, and you asked me.
Mean.
But in that work, I won't be that far away. But in that work, I'll be doing a lot of police reform, police community relations, prison reentry, dealing with folks coming out of the criminal justice system, youth education and training around mediation skills for young people to find alternatives to violence and deal with conflict. So there's a 20-second wrap-up of 20 years ago.
It's a small consolation.
I'm Jillian DiFalco. Professionally, I'm a substance abuse counselor, but I am also part of Kingston's and the New Jim Crow Action Network, or ENJAN for short, which is a prison advocacy organization that deals with educating the public about mass incarceration and the hopes to end mass incarceration. Our most recent project is a returning citizens program that I'm going to be facilitating in Kingston Kingston and in Poughkeepsie.
And you've worked with returning citizens, or no, you've worked with people incarcerated before, correct?
Yep, I used to work in a prison, mainly counseling people who committed sex offenses, but I talked to many of the inmates in the general population too.
Awesome. Cool. So, can you talk a little bit more, and you can jump in whenever. I'm gonna, have some questions that are like kind of general and others that are more targeted. But can you just explain a little bit more about the Returning Citizens program that's going to be starting soon in Poughkeepsie and Kingston, right?
Yeah. So, the founder of ENJAN, Odell Winfield, he handed me a book one day and he was like, "Hey, can you think of anything that we can do with this?" So I flipped through it, and it was written by a returning citizen, so somebody coming out of prison, and he wrote his autobiography, and then he wrote a workbook designed to help people come up with a game plan for staying out of prison. So it's called Changing Your Game Plan, How I Used Incarceration as a Stepping Stone for Success. And in the workbook, it's broken up into 52 chapters and deals with things like finding housing, finding a job, coming up with a way to reconnect with your family, figuring out how to navigate, coming home and not getting involved with the same people that, you were caught up in before you went to prison. And it's really just kind of like 1 or 2 pages for each chapter, and then afterwards it gives you a bunch of questions that you have to like really reflect on and answer. So the purpose of the program is to allow the people that are coming home from prison to do maybe 2 chapters a week, really think about their answers, write them down, and then when they come to the group, we're going to have a discussion so that they can kind of bounce ideas off of each other and really solidify what their game plan is going forward so that they can stay out of prison and, really maintain a positive re-entry process so that they can, become a positive member of society again, acclimate to the world. If you've done 5, 10, 20 years in prison, you come out, technology has changed, your family structure might have changed, people might have moved away. So coming out, and it's kind of a culture shock. You don't know what you're gonna, how you're gonna fit into this new society. So if you don't know who you are, you're certainly not gonna be able to navigate this new, territory that you've been so disconnected from for all these years. So, really figuring out who you are in the process of going through the workbook is something that I hope that the participants grasp.
It's really comprehensive too. I was kind of just like looking through it, and it has like one of the chapters talks about like having discussion with your children and like explaining to them because why you've been missing and all that kind of stuff. How to talk about it, how to explain it to your kids, or at least guidelines about it. Really good stuff.
I mean, success in that circumstance requires, a sense of community, big C and small c, your family community, your relationship community, but then, that broader question of how do you reintegrate to a changing community, how do you integrate with changes in job opportunities, and all those kind of dynamics that once you, get on the path. And what sounds powerful about this piece is that it forces a sense of reflection, a sense of contemplation, and the word I like to use all the time is intent. Like, we can sort of refocus and have folks find the time to reflect and achieve their intent on where they see their lives going, and then you surround them by a supportive community that helps them contemplate, consider, react, and then, really sort of move forward at a pace of support. I think the hardest reality, and I don't know this firsthand, but just in the work that I've done, is feeling disconnected, isolated, and not part of a fabric. And this sort of space and place and exercise sounds like it's really moving in that direction, so creating a texture.
Yeah. So you've done a lot of work. So I'm going to be manipulatively steering this conversation into a direction in a minute. But obviously also you should all talk about as much as you want to talk about. But can you speak a bit on gentrification, which is one of the issues you've worked on professionally, both in the context of the effects of gentrification on communities, and also maybe tactics communities can use. I mean, you don't have to go into super detail, although you can absolutely can if you want. Tactics that communities can and have used to kind of combat that, to fortify themselves, strengthen themselves, and yeah.
Right. So a lot of the work that I've done in this conversation has been in the South Bronx, and the South Bronx has been this interesting paradigm. You know, Brooklyn was lost as soon as Bill Clinton, or Harlem was lost as soon as Bill Clinton moved on to 125th Street. Brooklyn fell like a domino just maybe a decade after. The South Bronx is now experiencing, you know, its inertia regarding gentrification. And it's a catch-22. I mean, you know, I'm talking about organizations, working with organizations of community-based developers that are nonprofits that are in it for developing housing for the poor and underserved. But the victims, they've become victims of their own success. In the case of the organization I work for, an organization called Nos Quedamos, spent 25 years really sort of doing some really hardcore work around community organizing, around community-based decision-making for housing and community planning and the like. They were successful in creating both, you know, homeowners and affordable rent paradigms for a lot of folks in that community. But once that work is done, then it creates the appeal for the excuse me, I'm a real double negative, the not nonprofit industry of housing, okay? And that's where, you know, we sit around and scratch our head all the time. It's like, you know, we feel like we built it, and now surrounding this enclave of what is real affordability, what is opportunities for working class families and poor families to find quality housing, is being surrounded by rings of new high-rises and the like, which of course we know puts pressure on communities to create new paradigms of commerce. You know, like I said, I use 125th Street as an example because if you go there now, you know, they've got their Whole Foods, they got their big box stores, and you know, what was once a corridor of community-owned commerce is no longer the case. And that's, you know, gentrification is one, yes, it's the housing stock, you know, creating affordability for the, you know, for the wealthy, and sort of abandoning those who are working class status, who then have to be pushed out further and further away from the city center. And then you also have what affects the commerce side of communities. You know, and like I said, it's a catch-22. I mean, there was a time when I was doing community surveys looking at the commerce in a community, and this was decades prior to this, you know, new era of gentrification that we've seen happen in New York. And you saw mom and pop stores, you saw small immigrant families, you know, sort of finding their economic foothold in a community, but for the most part it was small and family-owned operations. Redundancy, yes, you know, 6 Chinese restaurants on a span of 4 blocks, yes, you know, 3 liquor stores in the span. So, you know, you've got sort of the push and pull against what's quality, you know, where are the fresh produce, how do we fight against food deserts, how do we create spaces where families can feed their family on an affordable budget, real food, without spending their, you know, money on the value meal at the local fast food joint. So you know, you're battling those sort of circumstances. So you want, you know, supermarkets coming into your neighborhoods. You want, you know, a pharmacy that's not a big box pharmacy in your neighborhood. And that's the model that Nos Quedamos, the organization I previously worked with, was able to successfully achieve. Not only did they do 4,000 units of affordable housing and create about 800 new homeowners, but they also made sure they created the industrial, or the commercial space, I should say, for a small family-owned pharmacy, for the first supermarket that had been built in that community. And at the time, it was over 20 years. And you know, since then, others fall in line. So, you know, you battle between, you want to improve the conditions for folks on the ground, but then, you know, the battle is, once you've done it, now you become attractive. And if you have amenities like, oh my God, waterfront, now you're really in trouble, because that's where big money developers look, that's where, you know, they're trying to maximize dollars. So you'll have 100 units go up and 10 will be affordable, you know?
That's what happened in Kingston,
Mhm.
the waterfront. And now other parts of Kingston are like
Right.
next on the chopping block. But yeah.
I mean, that's,
And Poughkeepsie too, right?
Mhm.
Happened, yeah, on the waterfront, yeah.
so these are, but, you know, communities, there's the best thing communities can do, first of all, in terms of sort of pushing back against it, first is the information chain. I mean, be informed, be engaged, be at your planning board, be at your community board, you know, work on, you know, there are accountability points along the way. The challenge is most of us are too busy, too overworked, too burdened with life to really be sort of on the pulse of what's going on. So, you know, it comes down to professionals, and it comes down to those of us who chose to sort of sit in this space as our careers. But the key in that conversation was being engaged in the planning board. For the city was, you know, the community boards, where all projects, no matter what they're going to build, have to come before this group. And although they don't have any real power in the paradigm, at least you had a point where you can get information. You can find out who's doing what, where are they on the process of development. That's key for any community that really wants to sort of engage and be present. There are a lot of loopholes and checkpoints that are built into these processes, which require community information, community hearings, and the like. You know, I can more speak to New York because it's my, you know, what that much my work. But in most cases, federal dollars require this, state dollars require this, and in a lot of cases, even if you're a private developer, you're going to be getting some level of tax break, tax subsidies, and the like. And these are the kind of things that trigger these public hearing, you know, mandates. And those are key for folks.
Something seems to have happened. Or maybe we're still recording. Maybe everything's right.
You look right.
Maybe just the thing went away? I don't know. We're about to find out. We might have to edit this part out. So remember what you were saying.
Yeah, remember this. Figure out where we are.
And that's never happened before. I never just like disconnected like that. Preview not supported. Okay, it means that we're still recording.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
No. So it's all right. So you know, in sort of engaging in those checkpoints that are there, like I said, first step is being informed. Second point that I would sort of put on the table for community action is, okay, now you know something's happening. Now you know they're planning this development, and it's going to be 90% for folks who don't live in the neighborhood, can't afford, you know, folks in the neighborhood can't afford. So now you really, you get to the accountability point where you pressure, you know, local leadership, whether it be city councilman, town council, and what have you. Then you find out where are the subsidies based. Are the subsidies based in state subsidies or in federal subsidies? The further you get away from the local, the harder this proposition becomes. But, I mean, I've known examples. There are examples of organizations that have pushed back on state-funded, in the case of New York, city-funded, and even federally funded, you know, subsidies to ensure that the makeup really does reflect the needs of community and does not result in the pushing out of folks. So there's the information, you know, there's staying in the loop and being informed about what's going on. There's understanding where the accountability points are, where you can pressure, you know, a process. And a lot of times this stuff is what's hidden in the stacks of paper. It's in a little small line, covered by 12 pages of legalese. But if you can sort of pinpoint that, and again, I don't expect the average community member who's working 40, 50 hours a week to be in this position, but that's where we as professionals in this work really come in, is to really sort of be that gateway of, hey, you know you can do something about this, or there is a point at which your voice is critical to this conversation. And in some cases, not all, I wish I could say more than less, but there are times when pressure applied at the right point can stall a job, it can bring about concessions to communities, and in some cases jobs have been, projects have been X'd because the community has been able to exert the right amount of influence, protest, you know, expression of concerns, and forcing the hands of private developers to say, well, if they can't, create a space that is both in line with community needs and in line with their commercial, desires for capitalistic gains, then they walk away, and someone else will come along and pick that spot up. In all those cases, they'll like to tell you, like in the case of recently, the infamous Amazon deal, they like to tell you, oh my God, you're killing jobs and you're doing this and that and the third. But that fatalistic view is only a temporary prescription. Somebody else is going to come and pick up that space. Some other interest is going to come in and look at that opportunity and find a way to do it in a manner that will succeed with community concerns and that can coexist. But there's those pressure points of information, hearings, and then holding agencies and community leaders accountable to answer to community. Nobody wants to have that protest outside their office, and these tactics have been effective in the past.
I just had written down that they've been using, the industry has been using that argument with environmental stuff, with labor unions since like the 1800s. Oh, but we'll go out of business.
Right. It hasn't happened yet.
And never happened. Never happened. But they're still falling for the argument. Like they still use it. Everybody still falls for it. It's like so ridiculous.
Yeah, it's good buzz lines now.
It is.
Because thoughtful development, thoughtful planning, community engagement in the process produces higher success rates of projects getting done. And it creates, the path of least resistance when you have community engaged in the process, helping with the process of making decisions. And when you have that, you have a formula for success.
Yeah, absolutely. So now, here's where I'm leading somewhere. So, and we kind of touched on this with the previous discussion, but to me, it seems like gentrification and mass incarceration, well, let's say mass incarceration has a direct effect on gentrification, specifically the community's vulnerability. Because as you said, people are, they're overworked, they're tired, they're busy. So now, let's say you've taken, family members out of that equation, whether it's someone who's bringing in money, whether it's someone who's just helping, in whatever, just being part of the family. Or just members of the community in general, if you have a significant portion of your community missing, it's going to make it harder to take up those fights. So yeah.
I mean, you look at that, and there's the macro that looks at sort of the ability for a community to grow and sustain and create income, wealth, ownership, and so forth. So anybody who's not spending 10 years in prison, can really find some other way to sort of engage those 10 years to the benefit of themselves and their families. But then there's also that micro thing that happens where, okay, so prior to the new project, the high-rise coming in, of course, they're going to come in and sweep the area, over-police that section of a community, and you find that minor offenses that would not be of significance in a place, outside of the target zone, and become much more, heightened and much more expressed when they're trying to clean up the area. So that's one thing. Then there's the other. There's the post effect. There's the post-development effect. A lot of things that happen in Brooklyn. There's a nice article written about this where a community activist wrote an article saying, if you're going to move to the neighborhood, don't call the police because your neighbor that's been here for 20, 30 years sits out on their porch on Sunday with their family and plays cards. If you're coming into a community, there are mores and norms that have existed in a neighborhood, and especially when you talk about old neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, or even Harlem. You've got history in these communities where generations have experienced their life the way that community has decided it's okay. And then here comes our new imports from Michigan who don't understand that, in the summertime, the guys are going to sit on their stoop outside at their table, and they're going to play dominoes, and they're going to laugh. They may have their little radio out, but this is part of what summertime in Brooklyn and Harlem is. A new arrival, that's what I call it, won't understand that and be under the expectation that, the standards of this neighborhood are going to be the same as the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and it's not. It's two different neighborhoods, two different communities, two different ways of living, and then it's been going on for hundreds of years. So, you know, you create that sort of macro policy-driven, let's clean up the area for the new high-rise. And then you've got that other push of how do you know, folks who don't understand the community come in, buy a home, or God bless them, more power to them, but then decide that they want to regulate their neighbors through the police. And that causes not only, you know, discomfort and conflict between neighbors, new arrival and old, but then of course, you know, when black and brown people encounter the police, they are more likely to end up incarcerated for one reason or another. So, you know, there's this, the idea of policing and gentrification, yeah, they go hand in hand. One comes in prior at one level, and then the other comes in after at another level. And, you know, again, this is a question of, you know, policing for who, housing for who, and hence the argument of gentrification. You know, improvement for who, you know?
So, with returning people, I guess part of that culture shock might be coming back to neighborhoods that have become radically changed, which could, in certain circumstances, actually, again, with new arrivals, make it more likely that they might end up getting sent back, you know, some sort of like probation violation. And is there anything you want to add to that? It's so quiet over here.
That's what's got me running on.
Well, it reminds me of the show OG, the last OG,
yes.
when he comes back.
Right.
And there's, you know, the hipsters on the corner. He was just like, who, what? And he was so taken aback, like,
what happened to
is
Brooklyn?
There goes the neighborhood.
He said, what happened to Brooklyn? Right.
Yeah. And all that culture that he was so used to was lost and gone. And like, you have this new wave of people coming in that are completely different from, you know, what you're used to. It's a culture shock.
Yeah. Cool.
And I think that goes into, you know, trying to find a job. If before you went to prison, all the people that had jobs that you aspired to have looks like you, and then you come back and all the jobs that you can get with your record are 20-something-year-old white kids who don't look like you at all.
Or that even that age gap in and of itself. I mean, they, you know, if you're, you know, 30-something, pushing 40, you know, and, you know, the best scenario you have available for you at the moment is surrounded by, you know, 18 to 22-year-olds, you know, that's a real disconnect for you mentally, socially, you know, and, you know, it's, yeah, I don't envy having to be in that scenario. I mean, where, you know, you expect, you know, it's almost like getting left back in school, you know what I mean? It's like you really want to sort of feel like you're in the company of peers, in the company of like-minded folks that, and again, it goes back to that sense of community, that you feel like you're integrated and have a tapestry of community, whether it be in your workplace, in your neighborhood, at your church, synagogue, or what have you. And if you don't, if you're constantly feeling that you're forcing yourself out of a sense of isolation, you're combating that sense of isolation or feeling odd, out of place, then that really is the mental space that, you know, creates this sad resignation that, oh, life was better in prison. You know, and that's, you know, and we know that's not the case, but, you know, the human psychology is fragile in and of itself, so, you know.
And then you're dealing with another obstacle, you know, the ageism. So maybe your employer, maybe you're a good employer, but a more reliable one would be somebody who doesn't have kids, who doesn't have to take off work to take their kid to a doctor's appointment, or because their kid is sick. You know, so you're dealing with so many more obstacles than if you never went to prison and you could have a job similar to that of your, you know, cohort.
Going back to new arrivals, and something that we had talked about in the previous discussion too, and something I saw a really great meme on Facebook about, was when not to call the police.
Right.
And there was this. It was. They had taken this thing that said, when do you tell the teacher or not? And it was meant for like kindergartens. When do you tell the teacher? And when do you just handle it on your own? So this is aimed at like 5 and 6 year olds. But it was things like, is the situation under control? Is someone hurt? And just like it was like 4 very basic things, and then they just crossed out teacher and wrote police, and it was like obviously perfectly applicable, because we are seeing, like, I just saw something on, the internet, everything's on the internet these days. This woman called the police on some guy and was just like, he looks like an illegal. So now it's like they're calling the police when someone looks like an, and it, that's an extreme example, but how many times do we hear stories about people being arrested, like walking into their own homes because of some new arrival, doesn't know their neighbors, and like sees a person of color walking into a house and assumes they must be going in to rob it, that couldn't possibly live there. So that's a huge thing, and and it's not just about racism. I mean, it's also it's gotten to the point where we feel like the police are our parents, and that's a very dangerous dynamic, because then it makes us children. So we're not, instead of adults living our adults' life, but it's like welcoming the police state, and like that's so scary that people have that mentality. But again, obviously, it's even more dangerous when it's involving people of color. What were you gonna say?
Well, I'm just saying, there's a question of being a neighbor or just being the person that lives next door. A neighbor says, hi, my name is, this is my son, this is my family. A neighbor sort of seeks to at least have a sense of rapport and engagement with the folks that surround them. That to me is a neighbor. Whereas the person that lives next door, well, that's who's not going to say anything to you coming and going during the day, no matter how many times I see you in the day. That's the one who's going to call the police instead of saying, hey, Anthony, baby's sick. Could you turn it down just a little bit? Sure, gotcha. Understood. Where we, sort of meet each other at a space of, we share a mutual desire for each of us to live in peace, each of us to live in comfort that we can provide for ourselves. And this, and this is it's not rocket science, but for some reason, when you come into a community and you've already decided that your neighbor is an other, well, then it's you've already told yourself it's okay. I don't have to speak to them, they're other. I don't have to deal with them, I can call the police. I cage up myself, lock up my windows, and we all fend for ourselves, but that's not community. It's not community at all. And I think that's the challenge for folks that are entering these neighborhoods and sort of find themselves there, is to come in and work on being a neighbor, work on being a member of the community on the block. I mean, in New York, I keep harping New York is where my experiences are, but what's happening in Brooklyn and Harlem and now in the South Bronx, but these communities are blocks. Like, there was a time when you knew almost everybody from one corner to the other on your neighborhood. You definitely knew all the kids. Your parents knew all the parents of the kids. So there was a sense of, when I say I'm going to Bobby's house, mom and dad knows Bobby's mother or grandparents, so they know where I'm going. In this new era, that is far from the case anymore, which means that, my new neighbor will look at my kids suspiciously. And my kid's been on that block longer than you have. You know what I mean? And that's that strange dynamic where, sure, own your home, more power to you, but also own the community and be a part of it. Don't just own and be present without, seeking to do what we should be doing as community. Being healthy neighbors.
So we're going to take a break in a bit. 1, because I'm a little hungry, and 2, we have to, for editing purposes. But is there anything you want to add to that before we take a break?
No, I agree. I think community is very important when, especially, from my perspective, when you're coming out of prison and re-entering society, feeling comfortable, because I think coming out of prison comes with a lot of healthy paranoia of they know. Right. They know I've done time. Right. They probably don't think that I've changed. Right. And entering a community that you know each other, you can get to know each other, that paranoia will kind of decrease, and you'll feel more comfortable and feel less isolated.
Yeah. All right, so we're gonna take a brief break and we'll be back to talk a bit more.
Hi, welcome back. Now, I wanted to show you about some of the material that we have started setting up in the adult collection that belongs to some of the elders that's in the elder circle, particularly A.J. Williams-Meyers. We're starting to put his collection together here, and then we have some of the other writers. But as you can see, Angela Davis, John Carlos, these are folks that we have discussed in some of our community discussions. And we have a number of folks that we have used with some videos. Slavery by Another Name. We have James Baldwin's. We did I'm Not Your Negro. So we have a section on James Baldwin's work. We have some Malcolm X. We have different authors that's, that we are really excited about, and making sure that the community are here to understand who they were. If We Must Die. I mean, I can go on about the collection. The pictures up top, it's from the Civil Rights Movement. Those are actually pictures from the 1967, 68 struggle in Alabama and Mississippi. And they was donated to the library by Jim Pepler, nationally known photographer. So this is the basic collection that we're putting together. I would like for you to come back when it's completed. So, keep us in mind. All right? Thank you.
So everybody be smart. Go. Okay, sorry. So the title of this episode is Mass Incarceration, Black Lives Matter. Actually, I think it's the other way around. But so I'm just going to put it to you, why is mass incarceration a Black Lives Matter issue? Or how are they related?
I think if you look at any prison, or look at the way that the criminal justice system is set up, you'll see the disproportionate amount of Black and Latino men and women, at all stages of the criminal justice system, whether arrests or indictments, all the way up to actual incarceration. There's many more Black and brown men and women that are, ultimately incarcerated than there are white people. And, I think a lot of people like to say, well, that's just because, moral failings on the part of Black and brown people, and that's not true, because even when you're looking at the same exact crime being committed, and you go through the chains of the criminal justice system, a person, two people that were arrested for an armed robbery, for instance, Black and brown people tend to have harsher sentences and longer sentences than white people for the same exact crime. So that kind of debunks the whole, it's a moral failing on the part of the community of Black people in general. And, like you said in the beginning, I worked in a prison, and just walking through the halls, it was mostly Black and Latino men that I encountered. Very few white people that were in prison. At least in the prison that I was in, it was in a maximum security prison in New York. So I think that in and of itself kind of points to the fact that mass incarceration is very closely intertwined with Black Lives Matter, or should be intertwined with the Black Lives Matter movement.
The conceptual frame of Black Lives Matter is, of course, we know it began in this conversation about policing and the effects of policing on community, and the what we were seeing more pronouncedly now, the killing of black and brown people by police. But when you really, put the question in the broader context, Black Lives Matter is a question that we should be posing on almost every lens of our society, because we know historically, the patterns of who is disadvantaged in our society, how are they disadvantaged, and how, an uncontrollable characteristic of a human being, the color of their skin, which none of us have any control over, becomes the stigma, the indicator, the factor that predicts educational attainment, wealth, home ownership, credit ratings, on through to the likelihood of encounters with police. So we're not going to unpack that bag because it's too much stuff. We only have a little bit of time. But in the context of mass incarceration and policing of black and brown people, I mean, between Michelle Alexander's work on the new Jim Crow, and then the subsequent documentary on the 13th Amendment, which really looked at how, what was supposed to have been the emancipation of a people, really created a paradigm by which, controlling of black bodies transferred from the slave-owning plantation paradigm to a policing paradigm. And I mean, it was almost immediate. It was almost immediate following emancipation. What we see now is hundreds of years of impact, of intentional systemic engagement that has constantly been bending towards injustice, particularly aimed at black men and then subsequently grabbing black and brown men along the way as populations and poverty is concentrated. But in this context of where Black Lives Matter and mass incarceration come together, because I mean, we're really looking at, the trend of black and brown women, of course, has been probably the most growing trend in the last 20 years, but we know that historically, like again, going back to emancipation and Reconstruction, it was targeted at black men. I mean, and when you talk about social services in the 50s and 60s, when the paradigm shifted from, okay, we're going to preserve the family, free food programs, whatever the sort of the social welfare programs of the day were at that time. Speed up to about the 60s, and then you had the requirement, it was mandated in most city and federal programs, that the father could not be in the household for services to be delivered to that household. So it forced this sort of pushing out of, take a look at it. It was social service policy. There's even a movie made about it where, not only could you not work, but you couldn't have the father in the home with the family in order for services to be provided. Now we could have all kind of arguments about the economics of social service programs and what conservatives like to call handouts and all that, and I'm not going to unpack that back right now. I'm just saying that what that did to a family, what that did to a community, what that does to the psychology of children, watching that play itself out. Then you apply this over-policing of communities, particularly black and brown communities. And then, you have this modern paradigm where, and it's not a modern paradigm, we're just seeing it more in the killing of young black men and black boys, the targeted arrest of youth, the criminalization of youth. I mean, things that young people were being arrested for in the last 20 years, was so simplistic, but now they're resulting in, warrants and all these other sort of probation and all these other linchpins that keep this individual, this young man or this young woman tied to the penal system, and the fact that it's targeted. New York's, I think they did a survey, and I wish I could quote the exact survey, but I can tell you the finding, and that was, they looked at the state penitentiaries around New York, and they realized that an overwhelming majority, and I'm not going to quote data because I can't quote it accurately, but an overwhelming majority of the population was from 4 neighborhoods, 6 neighborhoods in New York, South Bronx, Brooklyn. You know, you could almost predict where this population of a prison was coming from out of New York City. That meant that there was, you know, and again, I'm not going to touch on rising and falling crime rates, and we know that crime has been falling rapidly over the last 30 years. And the trends have been going away from the indicators that you should have increased incarceration because crime has been going down. But with that said, you still have this targeted policing in certain communities. And that in and of itself lets you know that, yeah, you systemically they call it high crime neighborhoods. And in the perspective of those who are living there, they're over-policed neighborhoods. And this is sort of the layer after layer after layer, which shows you that not only do you have poor housing, poor education, poor community institutions to serve, you know, communities and individuals in need, then you have over-policing, unemployment, you know, keep each layer of that cake really gives you, you know, the sort of Black Lives Matter issues, and they're all in there. They're all in there, and I think you can't, you know, you can't look at, you know, putting the matters aside. You know, you talk about Black lives, and you know, we'll expand Black to include Black, Brown, and all of oppressed groups. When you're dealing from that lens, you can see that those lives are constantly being under attack by one sort of systemic flaw, one intentional form of oppression after another. And I think that's where, you know, the idea of, yeah, Black Lives Matter may have started as a police conversation, but it's much broader than that if we're really going to take on the meaning of that phrase, Black Lives Matter.
So now it's more also, or not, it's more like quality of Black
right,
lives also
exactly,
matters. It's not even about keeping them alive, it's about the quality of those lives.
Because existence does nothing, you know, we want people to thrive.
Right. Yeah, totally.
Mm-hmm.
Those are awesome. Even better answers than I even expected. Blow me away. Because, you know, my go-to kind of like rap about, you know, about this is more just, well, you know, Black Lives Matter, it's mass incarceration is what happens if you survive your encounter with the police. If you don't get shot and killed first, then you end up in prison. Which is a much more simplistic answer than the great answers you guys gave. Because you mentioned Michelle Alexander's book, which is actually how ENJAN started. I was actually part of that first reading of Michelle Alexander's book about 8 years ago, and then out of that we started ENJAN, and then I think shortly after that my schedule changed. I ended up not being able to be part of it anymore, but now I've rejoined it in the Kingston branch. But yeah, so that's how ENJAN came about. So we did a reading of that, and everybody's like, okay, well, this is great. We're all informed now, but like, what are we going to do about this? And so the community all, you know, came together, and it was all centered around the Sadie Peterson African Roots Library in Poughkeepsie, which started first, and then the Kingston ENJAN group began, and Odell is the one who started basically all of this. Odell, who you have been seeing giving a virtual tour of the African Roots Library in Kingston, the A.J. Williams African Roots Library. But then I think that library opened 2 years ago?
I think 2 years ago.
2 years ago? Yeah. So anyway, it's all coming together. Awesome. Is there anything else that you would like to mention or talk about or bring up, discuss? Would y'all have for breakfast? No, I'm just kidding.
I mean, all that I would add is just the importance of, you know, this work, dialogues across the different sort of facets of these engagements. You know, when we bring, you know, activists in housing and counseling and working with folks that are sort of ending their incarceration and sort of taking those steps to reintegrate themselves in the community. When we connect all this tapestry, like we were just talking about, in the Black Lives Matter context, then we get to that sense of community. We get to that sense of a holistic tapestry of engagements, which not only secures the person re-entering society out of prison, but should be able to connect and provide the spaces and the counseling where kids and families and parents are sort of re-engaging, and where, you know, community serving institutions are looking at how to engage this population. And my challenge to all of us who do this work is, it's not necessarily needing to do something new, it's just making sure that what you're doing is connected to other spaces and places, so you create that sort of full catchment of care. Because sure, I can punch you in the way of a job, but if you don't have, you know, a group to sit with and talk to about some of these issues we were talking about in dealing with the workforce and this change, or, you know, how to get the support to mediate your family's issues and give folks the skills to sort of sit in those spaces and be vulnerable to those conversations and to those histories and impacts that our lives are having on our children, our families, our parents, and the like. You know, without that whole circle, one missing link could be the key to us not having been able to serve, you know, the family, the individual, the community, the neighborhood well. You know, so I think it's most important that we continue to sort of bring these conversations closer to one another.
One day I'll get everybody in a room together.
Right.
One day.
Right.
And I think, you know, especially with the socialization of men, and most, you know, people that are incarcerated are men, coming home where your family had to kind of survive without you. So trying to navigate how you're going to fit into the family structure when they've created their lives so that they didn't need to rely on you. It can be very damaging to you know, a man coming home feeling like, well, I'm supposed to provide for my family, but I don't know if there's, you know, how am I supposed to fit into this dynamic now that I've been away for so long? You know, nobody's calling me up to help them fix something. Nobody's relying on me for my income. You know, what's my purpose? So finding, I think for people coming home from prison, finding their identity again when they haven't had, you know, that the identity might be it might be completely different from what their identity was before they went to prison. You know, and I think that's again where community comes in. Like, you know, you're finding your identity through your connections with other people, and that's, you know, that's difficult.
And the families too. I mean, to me, it's very similar to people, you know, coming home from having been away at war, because you're still that culture shock. It's a completely different world, and your family, who, you know, there's that dynamic that develops while you're gone, but then they're also figuring out how to best help you, welcome you back into the family, and it can be very, very, very hard in either circumstance, in both circumstances, and, you know, having a community to help with that is because it's it's a struggle for not just the returning citizen but also the family members, and them trying to find the best ways to help their family member returning.
And you brought up vulnerability, which I think is huge, especially in a population where when you go into prison and it's this hyper masculinity and you have to be this wall and don't let anybody in, and you can't be vulnerable in prison. And then you come home and you have to ask people for help because you can't drive yet and you need somebody to drive you to parole, or you have to get a ride to a job interview, or you don't have any clothes because you've been away for 20 years and you're not the same size that you were, and the styles have evolved. And asking for help when you had to just do everything on your own while you were in prison, like that in and of itself is a culture shock and a huge, you know, could be a blow to somebody's ego if you're used to, you know, I was a big guy in prison and now I'm coming back and I need to ask my wife or my mom to drive me somewhere. That's
and I mean, and the psychology of, you know, in a lot of ways, there's a forgiveness that must be asked of your family, friends, neighbors, you know, relatives, about, you know, righteous or unrighteous, you know, having spent time incarcerated, you know, there's a pain that has been inflicted on those who weren't serving. And, you know, it's that sense of there's a humility,
sense of atonement that needs to be part of your process. You know, even in trying to explain it to your children. You know, yeah, I didn't do anything wrong, but still, I ended up in prison for 5 years. The child's not going to understand, you know, the systemic problem of policing of black and brown people. They just want to know, where's my daddy, where's my mommy, and why haven't they been here? And there's an atonement and a vulnerability and a pain that the individual and the family has to sort of work through. Without the skills and the sort of sense of how do I have the sense of awareness and humility to, you know, to share and give and, you know, do that process. You know, when you're coming out of this, I'm a wall, nothing touches me, I have no emotions sort of paradigm, that can be really hard. I mean, that's a process that you know, requires, again, that vulnerability, that humility, that humbling yourself, and it's very different, you know, very different challenge than staying alive.
We're going to go from survival to thriving.
Right.
The theme that ties us all together today.
Right. From survival to thriving,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you both so much, and for all the work that you do, even though it's taking you to Baltimore. Can't believe you just, terrible. When are you leaving?
About a month. It'll be about a month.
All right, well, that's some time to
There's-
get used to the idea.
And I won't be that far
And we
away.
want a schedule posted
I'm
at
not that
Snugs
far away, right.
of when you're going to be in
Right,
town,
right.
and we expect you to be
Oh,
prompt.
I will.
All right.
I'll be coming home.
Okay.
I'll be coming home.
All right. Yeah, we'll see. There's still a month for me to stab. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Awesome. Well, thank you both very much.
Thank you, guys.
So all the information for the various groups that we talked about in this discussion, the previous discussion, there'll be links, you know, Up Kingston and TMI Project, ENJAN, and everything else I can think of will be under the video in the see more. Click on the thing in the right, the description box. I know the internet. I know how to use the internet. I do.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah.
So yeah, so all the information will be there, so you can get more information on all these different things that we've been talking about. And yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
This has been Catalyst, a De facto Community Center project production. Much love and thanks to our guest speakers and participants. Contact us at npzdefactoproject@gmail.com. For more info and updates, join our Facebook group, NPZ De facto Community Center Project. To donate, go to gofund.me/HMTG6G.